But the thing that I think that's beautiful is that, in a generation we grew up, maybe we didn't talk openly about gender and sexual orientation. But kids today are asking questions. They're
Mhm.
not just like sitting with this is this and that is that, and yay, mom and dad told me, and here we go. They're actually asking questions. And those questions to me are the most powerful thing we can do as we start to grow and express ourselves and develop as human beings. And it's the shutting down of those questions, talking about, the ego. When we shut down those questions, that suddenly shuts down the ego as well,
Mhm.
because the ego can't learn, the ego can't grow, we can't become if we're
Mhm.
not in a place where questions are encouraged.
Hi, everyone. This is the Ego Project, where we do the perfectly imperfect work of healing our ego wounds. And I am Lisa Heidle, and I am here with.
Cristine Seidell, and together we have.
John Sovec, an LMFT in Pasadena, California.
Mhm.
Welcome, John. We're so excited that you're here with us. We've got a therapist and an author, and we've got a therapist and an author, and we're very excited. What we're going to do is I'm going to do a real quick housekeeping, and then we're going to read John's bio. Then we're going to jump into this amazing conversation that we're going to have. So we want to encourage everyone to check out our link on Instagram and in our bio here in the description notes for Joy Malik's workshop on attachment strategies. Sorry, I couldn't get it out. On attachment strategies. And if you use the code TEP10, the Ego Project 10, TEP10, you get 10% off. This is an evergreen workshop. You have full access to it after you purchase it once, and it is so valuable. I've learned so much about avoidance and anxious attachment. I've been working on my secure attachment, and I understand my insecure attachment. I feel like I am a walking font of information now after this workshop. What do you think, Christine?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a wonderful workshop, and Joy just does such a great job explaining it and kind of attending to you personally so you can kind of continue your work. So,
And I
Thank
was telling the two of you as we were coming on that I actually know Joy personally,
Mhm.
and her name describes her to such a deep level.
Yes.
And this workshop and the work she's doing is so powerful and so
Mhm.
wonderful.
Absolutely. Yes.
you, John. We so agree. And it's so exciting now that our network is growing and everyone's starting to know each other. So thank you for sharing that. Joy's going to be so excited
Yeah.
to know that.
Yes.
So we're going to jump in. I'm going to read your bio, John, and then we're going to ask you some very important questions about the LGBTQIA plus community. Thank you. All right. So as we said, John is a therapist and an author and coach in Pasadena, California, who specializes in working with LGBTQIA plus youth and their families during the coming out process. He is the author of Out, A Parent's Guide to Supporting Your LGBTQIA plus kid through coming out and beyond, and is a nationally recognized expert on creating affirmative support for LGBTQIA plus youth. His work has been featured on The Ricky Lake Show, OWN, Bravo, The Advocate, ABC, LA Talk Radio, The Washington Post, and columns for Huffington Post, Medium, and Good Therapy. Oh, that's such a good
Mhm.
bio, John. And we're so excited to have this conversation with you because
Mhm.
it's timely and it's so important for
Mhm.
parents, for people who are coming out, and for everyone else on the planet.
Mhm.
So, in my
Absolutely.
opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, we're at a very challenging time in our development as human beings, and that there's a lot of pushback against the LGBTQ community. And unfortunately, a lot of that is landing on the shoulders of youth.
Mhm.
And it's really, really challenging to watch them have to go through this because we know kids today, they are on social media 24/7. They know what's going on in the world.
Mhm.
So to have them see all this hate and vitriol spewing out from a lot of the leaders, it's really challenging for them. And it's a time I think where all of us need to come together and support not just the adult LGBTQ community, but also the kids that are in the coming out process.
Mhm. Absolutely. That's such a great point.
Are you seeing a lot of clients, both Christine and John, who are coming in and this is a very important topic for them to be speaking, like they're addressing it faster, it's part of the vernacular earlier, like is that what you're seeing with especially youth clients?
Yeah, I know in my practice, because I specialize in it, that is a conversation that sits in the room quite often. But the thing
Mhm.
that I think that's beautiful is that, in a generation when we grew up, maybe we didn't talk openly about gender and sexual orientation. But kids today are asking questions. They're
Mhm.
not just like sitting with this is this and that is that, and yay, mom and dad told me, and here we go. They're actually asking questions. And those questions to me are the most powerful thing we can do as we start to grow and express ourselves and develop as human beings. And it's the shutting down of those questions, talking about, the ego. When we shut down those questions, that suddenly shuts down the ego as well,
Mhm.
because the ego can't learn, the ego can't grow, we can't become if
Mhm.
we're not in a place where questions are encouraged.
Absolutely. It's a great point. And I would have to say, just to your point around, our youth seeing in social media or the media, like some very polarizing narratives around, the LGBTQ community. If they are not in a supportive home, even if they haven't even started the process of coming out, but they're aware it's not supportive, and then they look out into social media and see very negative messages, I mean, that can be a very isolating place for individual kids to be, and luckily, we do have access to other things in social media, but that's scary for kids to be in a in-home community, especially where I live, where it can be still very conservative. To be in a home, where it's not supported, then go out and see in social media some very scary messages. These kids really need support.
And I
So,
think it's hard too, because for most parents, when I talk to them, they grew up in a world where, let's say maybe you had a rough day at school, or you got bullied or teased about something. You would go
mhm,
home, you would maybe have a snack, do some homework. I would escape into reading. That was my safe place. A good book would make the bad stuff go away.
mhm,
And then maybe you'd have dinner with your family, and then maybe go to bed and wake up the next morning, reset, maybe
mhm,
ready to step back into it. But
mhm,
these days, kids are experiencing a 24/7 bullying and teasing cycle, and
mhm,
there's no recovery time. And just think of being under that type of scrutiny
mhm.
every waking moment. And these kids stay up till like 2 in the morning checking out social media to make sure they're not missing anything.
Yep.
Even if they're a kid who's being bullied, they still don't want to miss what's happening out there.
Yep.
And I think it's so important for parents to understand this different paradigm that exists for kids and their well being.
So true. So true. And just really these kids being in this activated state, and not really getting that reset at all. Mm.
Yeah.
With your book, out, A Parent's Guide to Supporting Your LGBTQIA plus kid through coming out and beyond. When you wrote this book, obviously you wrote this because you saw a need, right?
Mhm.
And what kind of ego work did you personally do when you were writing this book? I was very curious because I know for me as a writer, that's how I process.
Mhm.
So I was a little curious about what kind of work you did, and then we'll delve into how this can help others. But I was curious about your own process.
Mm.
Well, I think the first thing that comes up from anybody who has a book in them is you're like, oh, I've got a great idea for a book. And then you hit the full ego stop that says, well, who am I to write this book? And you get caught in that. You get trapped in that for a while. And for myself, it was really about looking what was happening in my therapy room, what was happening in the world that I was doing my speaking work at, where I'm doing trainings and education. And I have information that could potentially help save a kid's life. And
Mhm.
if that's not something that'll just kick the ego to the side, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
And so, what it helped me do is put aside my own need to be right and be perfect as an author, and instead to be authentic as an author. I was really blessed because I had an amazing editor through my publishing company who helped me to find my voice. When you read the book is set up in a way, it's like 2 a.m, you're a parent freaking out, you pick up the book and I come in the room and sit down a chair next to you, pour you a cup of tea, and we chat about your fears, what's going on. I help give you some information. I listen to what's going on and what's scaring you about your kid coming out.
Mhm.
And that development of my voice really helped me to connect into the passion and the authenticity of bringing this process to life.
Mm. That's so true. And I think sometimes, as therapists, people will believe that we kind of have this all figured out, right? Like we know we've learned all how to do this, and our lives are perfect and we're practicing it every day. But I think that, being an author and a therapist is such a beautiful process, because you're really taking what you're doing in the therapy room and what is working, and you're getting this feedback from your clients and taking it to a book, is a perfect way to spread that message. But yes, like that moment of putting yourself out there, kind of coming out of the therapy room to help more, does get you into this space around, but is it good enough? So I think, thank you for sharing that, through the process, you do have that moment of like, is it perfect? Is it exactly the way everybody else wants it to be? But then checking yourself and saying, no, this is to help others and this is to serve. And so I need to move through this in order to show up in that space for others.
And in this type of work, for me, that's always the thing that helps balance that kind of ego state, is the passion for the work itself.
Mm-hmm.
For me, the message of getting this information to parents to how to support their queer kid as they're coming out, to be able to be there for them, that is so much more important than any little thing that I can do in the world. And when I
Yeah.
can lean into the passion of the message, then it takes the ego and like Ted's just like, okay, you go sit by the fireplace for a while. You go over there, do your thing, toast marshmallows, whatever you need to do over there. But we've got some information, we've got some work to do here. And it was a really beautiful collaborative process. Once again, I mentioned I had a great editor and I had a great team all the way along. My sample readers were really generous with their feedback. And by creating this big, beautiful loop, it also became more than just me.
So true. Yeah.
Yeah, I love the parallel of finding your own voice, and then what you talk about of using the narrative of your life and finding the narrative of your life, because they're the same thing, right? But first we have to find our voice before we can tell our narrative. They have to run next to each other and then intersect. And
Well,
I just love that imagery of that. It's so powerful. What do you mean by the narrative of a person's life? And that's how you work, correct?
yeah, I'm
Is
a
helping
I'm a
them find that.
postmodern narrative therapist. What that means in a general state is we talk about the way we describe ourselves in the world, the stories we tell about ourselves are the world that we live in. And so by examining that narrative and how we speak about ourselves, we examine how we can relate to the world differently. So that's where this narrative approach comes into play. And, for me, it is about being aware constantly. How do we describe ourselves? Not just externally, but internally. How kind or cruel are we with that internal voice? And how does that affect how we walk through the world? How many of those voices that are affecting or influencing our narrative are ours, or actually are other people's voices? In working with kids, and I'm sure Cristine, you feel this too, is there's this moment where a kid will say something that's so out of context with who they've been in the room. You're like, so which of your parents is that we're hearing right now?
Yes. Yes.
And for me, oftentimes finding that voice, finding that narrative is often about shedding the other voices that have influenced us in both positive and negative ways. And I know people sometimes react when I say that. Everyone's like, oh, get rid of the negative voices. But sometimes we also have to release the positive voices, because they also put us in the trap of, oh, this is the way I'm the best, so this is what I always need to do. By being aware that all of those different voices have influenced and shaped us, and the words we use, and the narratives we tell about our lives, that's where we can start to actually grow in places that we never imagined we could grow.
I love that you said being present and aware of the voices, right? Because they're running all the time, right? Like the chatter is always occurring, even in our subconscious. If we're not aware of it, these will loop and loop and loop. And like you said, that's where something will come out and it's like, that I don't know if that sounds true, right? So being aware, being very mindful to listen to the voice and be like, does that voice really ring true to me?
Mhm.
And be conscious of what you're actually allowing to be your narrative is I think that's where the shift of change occurs, because that presence of this doesn't fit, I don't think, or this does fit. I think I'm going to move forward with this voice or with this narrative. So I think that call to be present and aware is a good activator for anybody who's trying to start this ego work.
And one thing that I talk with clients about as a therapist, they often come in the room, and Cristine, maybe you experience this as well too, is, oh, I just want to make it go away.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say the likelihood of us making it go away, if it's been with you for like 35 years, is
Right.
very slim. But what we can do is make you aware of when it's trying to take over.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, one of the narratives I grew up with my mom. My mom grew up in the Depression era. She was very, very conscious of money, sometimes in a way that's detrimental to her enjoying her life experience. So she handed that off to me. And what I had to learn to do was just like, oh, there's this really cool like workshop I want to take, like Joy's workshop. Uh,
Link
and
below.
oh, there you go. And I'm like, oh, do I have the money to do it? And then I'll stop and I'll be like, oh, that's mom's voice. Okay, cool. Actually, I do have the money to do it, or I'm going to find the money to do it or manifest the money to do it because this particular thing is really important to me. Or mom's voice will step in and say, do you really need that? And I'll be like, no, I don't need a second pair of shoes, you know? But it's about our relationship to those narratives inside
Mhm.
that changes over time. And we can be aware when they're showing up. And if we can become aware when they're showing up, we can make a different choice.
Very good. Yeah.
You in one of I listened to an interview that you did, and where you're talking about when people come into your practice, a new client, what you ask them where they fall, right? What is their sexual orientation, their gender orientation? Am I saying that correctly?
Sexual orientation, gender identity.
Generate, thank you. And I was like, oh, that's so brilliant, because so often, like you were saying, we have to be able to understand what our narrative is.
Mhm.
And when we do it up front, like, oh, this is what I think or what I know, and this is where I fall, you can jump right into the conversation.
Mhm.
You don't have to do a build up. You don't have to keep walking around the issue, or trying to come around and approach it from a different point. It's all right there, and that's your narrative, and that's authentic.
And for parents especially, I do talk about this quite a bit in the book. If at a young age you make talking about sexual orientation and gender identity a part of the how our family speaks,
Mhm.
and age appropriate. It doesn't have to be overt. It doesn't have to be all these salacious things that we're being told are awful and we're grooming kids, because that does not happen. Um, but if we look at this idea of as parents, if we can be open about these conversations, then someday our kid could say to us something like, we've talked often about, sexual orientation, and I'm wondering if I might be bi. And then a parent can be present with that because the language exists in the family already. And
Mhm.
whether it's for their kid who might be cis and heterosexual, whether it might be for their kid who's non-binary or their kid who is a lesbian, because we've had these conversations, we're now creating a space where there can be an expansion of these really amazing facets of who we are. Sexual orientation and gender identity are very fluid. They don't just lock in place and this is who you are for your entire lifetime. They have this movement, this growth, if we're willing to trust ourselves and the people around us to be able to explore those conversations a little bit deeper.
Mhm. Absolutely.
I see this time as a bridge. I feel like we're in a bridge time from where, growing up and, for my age, it was taboo. You did not talk about sex. What you learned about sex was usually through peers or
Mhm.
trauma, really, interactions, that were not healthy. And then, and now we're moving into this bridge time where the youth are leading the way because they're not afraid to talk about it.
Mhm.
They're speaking, they're coming out to parents, they're, trying on different identities with it, and social media has caused a lot of negativity, but I think it's also a positive that it's given them a platform to discuss things that were taboo. And I hope the bridge is leading us to a place where, like you said, it's conversations in the family. And I know for me, I know a lot of people who are, LGBTQIA plus, yeah. And they fall in different categories, obviously, but so they're part of my world. So it's not unfamiliar when I have nieces or nephews that are around that because they're in my world. So is that what you're seeing as well? And what are your thoughts about that? That it's a bridge time?
So I would look at the fact that we actually started this bridge time about 5 years ago. And then what happened is people in a very egocentric state got freaked out. Okay, there are lots of adults that these questions are really, really scary. And so what's happened now is they put up toll gates on this bridge and they're trying to stop the momentum of this movement. And that's why for me, it's so important to come on like your show and have these conversations so that people who are listening can say like, wait a minute, I don't want that toll gate down for my kids or my next door neighbor or one of my aunts or uncles. I want that path, that bridge to be open for them. And perhaps by hearing us talk about this, that it'll open up a little bit more space because the gatekeepers right now are intense, their voices are loud. The thing that's really strange about it, if you look at it, they're actually a very, very small minority of people who are speaking very loudly. But if I talk to almost any adult human being that I come across, they're like, no, 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 no. I mean, I think I would be there for my kid. I think there is space. I might not understand it, but I love them. And that's the bigger movement that's hanging out in the background that these gatekeepers, I believe, are so afraid of. And talk about ego state.
We could talk about that all day.
I love
Fear
that.
and ego, yes.
We'll have some resources for people to go to, one, to use their voice to hopefully raise it, to push down some of that small percentage that is loud. Thank you for that. And I love that you jumped on the whole analogy there. You ran with it with the bridge. That's brilliant.
And I, John, I really like your point about, using the vernacular with, between parents and children. And we have a guest coming on that's going to talk specifically about attachment, especially, in early childhood. But I think that point goes so well with the LGBTQIA plus community, because if we can talk about, identity and orientation without any judgment, it's just a neutral language. It's just a vernacular that we start at a very young age. Then as the children begin to explore themselves, there's no judgment within themselves. It's just language that they have to communicate to caregivers and to parents that they trust, and we saw this in, so much of like, childhood development around using appropriate vernacular for our body parts so that they can communicate, appropriately without judgment. So I think that goes so well for parents who start this at a young age with their kids, are really creating a space for them to communicate about themselves without judgment.
And another piece to understand developmentally is kids actually have ideas about sexual orientation and gender identity at very young ages, sometimes 4 years old we're looking at. The thing is, they're not looking at it as sexual beings. They're looking at it as a way to move through the world. And what'll happen then is they'll see like, oh, all the other little boys in my class are being this way. Well, I don't feel that way, but I better line up because what do kids want most? To fit in and to be loved. And oftentimes loving means fitting yourself into something that may not be completely comfortable. Then we hit puberty, and that's when these conversations start to explode, because now we have a physical body that's also reactive to these sensations and feelings about self. And so that's oftentimes why we see, the coming out process becomes very forefront in adolescence, but it's been going on for quite a long time before the conversation actually comes out into the public.
That's a great point, that it's not necessarily this individual concept. It's more in this interrelationship type of dynamic as they see themselves within the scope of relationships. And not even at 4, they're looking in terms of peers, but not necessarily like just this individual identity. That's a great point.
Yeah.
And it seems, I'm not a parent, so, but I know a lot of kids. I've worked with kids my entire life, and I was one. So I use that as my so I think, like you were saying, the conversation has to start early. And I think, and I'm projecting here a little bit, but a parent who says, okay, I'm going to read this book as an example. Well, does that mean I'm going to, I think my kid is this, or I think my kid is that? It's kind of like, well, if I start talking about sex, they'll want to have sex, not, correlating the, gender identity and sexuality, but early sexuality. And, it's going to, and it doesn't. It actually, it's shown, right, that when you start talking about sex early, the kids they practice better birth control. They're more open about it. They come to you with questions. There's STDs can be eliminated when there's open conversation or avoided. So these types of things. So if you're talking about, lesbians and non-binary and gender identity early, it doesn't mean that your child will not be cisgender. It just means that the conversation will be open if they choose, or if they are homosexual, if they are non-binary. Remove that
So
choose.
one of the things about that, and this happens quite often when parents come in and like they have a kid who's newly out or a kid who they believe might be coming out, is sometimes I'll get a question and it's from a very fear-based place, and I hear it and I support it. It's like, well, are you going to turn my kid gay? Are you going to turn my kid trans? And it's like, well, first of all, I don't have that power. But what we are going to do is create a space where they can talk and discover about who they are. And that process of talking and discovering allows us to see all kinds of different variables about who we are as human beings in this world. And so nobody can convince or talk anybody into any sexual orientation or gender identity. It just doesn't work that way. We are who we are. We develop, we grow, we have different experiences in our lifetime. But reading my book is not going to make someone gay. Talking to me as a therapist is not going to make you trans. It is an aspect of who we are. And that's one of the things that I do talk about in the book, is this, you get this question from parents sometimes, what did I do wrong? And for me, that question insinuates that there is something damaged with your child. By you saying, I'm to blame for something that made my child this way, it sets up this dynamic that you are somehow sending a message that is not okay for your kid to be LGBTQIA+. And that's, talking about ego work, you need to step inside yourself and figure out what is that subtle, covert message that is coursing through me, that is making me ask this question: what did I do wrong that my kid is this?
Yeah, which of course the child is going to receive that projection. So yeah, it's so important, I think, for parents that, who may, be open and willing to have these conversations, and for parents who may not, maybe they are coming from a fear-based perspective, to do their own work before they start having these sexual conversations or identity conversations with their children across the board, right? And to your point, Lisa, when we just don't talk about sex or identity, right, then we have children that go into developmental stages with either ignorance and or confusion or whatever, and we're setting our children up for real harm that can last a lifetime, right? So yes, I think, doing that ego work as a parent or as somebody who has influence with children is so, so important. Mhm.
Well, and Christine, because you work with adolescents as well too, when parents, tell me, oh, my kids aren't having sex. It's like, well, I hate to tell you this, there's a really good possibility they are.
Right.
Maybe not in the terms that you're thinking of it, but they may be having sex. And if they're not having it, they are thinking about it, because that's what a body in puberty does.
Right.
All of these things start waking up. Our body, we have tingly bits, and suddenly there's reactivity and all of these things. So for parents to deny that their kids are sexual beings
Mhm.
is a misnomer, and a challenge for kids to be able to become authentically who they are.
Mhm.
So I always joke with parents, and then they give me that look. It's like, no, I am actually serious here.
Yeah. I'm not joking.
Well, and I think it's so important to remember that the parent is learning alongside the child.
Mhm. Mhm.
When
Hopefully.
you are being
Right, right. Mhm.
right, when you are, waiting until they come out,
Mhm.
when you are fearful that they're going to come out, right, or avoiding, then you have to play catch up.
Mhm.
And with someone who doesn't have the life experience that you have, and you're
Mhm.
also looking to someone who's trying to find their own identity, get comfortable with their own identity, to be your teacher. And that's kind of cruel when you think about it. It's unkind to do that. So learning early and being open to the information, irrelevant of whether you think your child is LGBTQIA plus, it's irrelevant. Learn,
Mhm.
edification, right? Use this. I mean, I don't have children. This book is fabulous for
Mhm.
me because
Mhm.
I have friends who have kids, right? And I can help them, if this is something that a path that they go down, I can, but just for my own
Mhm.
Yeah,
knowledge.
and this book is designed for parents and professionals, because I think it does open up a lot of space and a lot of conversation.
Mhm.
And I think it's important too for us to understand a really important paradigm of being an LGBTQIA plus kid. Okay. So I'm in my adolescence. I'm going to come out to my parents. I'm a queer man, but I look up at my parents, and my particular minority status is not represented in the family dynamic.
Mhm.
And I think people need to be really aware of that as parents, because a kid is looking up towards two cis het parents in most cases.
Right.
And
Mhm.
so when we have that dynamic playing out, there is a fracture in the system that really needs to be addressed.
Mhm.
I always tell parents too, it's like, look, educate yourself. Go to some resources such as PFLAG, Human Rights Campaign, Gleason, places that are going to provide you with really good factual information.
Mhm.
Go there. Come back a little bit more prepared, but also know you are never going to keep up with all of the verbiage that your kids have about being queer in the world. You are not. I do this work 24/7. I'm a queer man myself, and there are moments kids come in with something that's like,
They're like, "What?
so you
What's
need
that now?"
to help me understand what that is, because I don't think I've heard that one before. And so I think that's a burden that parents can take off of themselves a little bit.
Mhm.
But I also encourage that you as a parent should not be doing your emotional work, your reaction to your kid coming out, with your kid.
Mhm.
Do it
Mhm.
with your spouse, do it with a therapist, do it with a support group. But your kid is not your therapist or educator in LGBTQ 101. That
Mhm.
should not be their job. So I do think it's really important for parents to take care of themselves, so then they can take care of their kids.
Mhm.
You said that
Absolutely.
much better than I did, John. That was so good. That was exactly what I meant. It was so good. That's exactly what parents need to understand. It's not their kid's job to teach them. It
Mhm.
just
Mhm.
isn't. So, I pulled a couple of reviews for your book that I want to share and discuss with you and Christine. And the first one, because we're talking a lot about kids, but as I said earlier, I was a kid once. We all were,
Mhm.
right? And so that was a long time ago that sometimes people come out. And so one review was, I wish my parents had this guide when I was growing up, as it would have made a world of difference. Even today, at almost 50, I'm desperate for my mom to sit down and read this important work.
Mm.
And I want to talk to you about what, we're talking about kids today currently, but what happens with, years ago, the parent really dropped the ball. What is the first piece of advice you'd give that parent about maybe doing some healthy repair in their relationship?
The first thing I think a parent should do is find a way to forgive themselves. I think the only way we can open up these types of conversations honestly is by moving into our own form of forgiveness. Forgive ourselves for the ignorance of how we were at that moment. Forgive ourselves for following the norms of the time. Forgive ourselves for being so busy trying to keep the household together that we didn't make time to hear our kid. To find the forgiveness for ourselves first, and then create a space where you can sit down with your adult child and say, hey, I want to know more about who you are.
Mm.
And it's important to understand that when we can move into these spaces, we can alter relationships, we can grow and change together. And we also need to be aware, especially with the name of this podcast, when our ego gets in the way and we start feeling that tightening right here in our chest when we get defensive. Because for me in my life, when that happens right there, that tightness in the chest, that's always my moment like, okay, take a breath. Something in this room is setting you off. Okay. And that's when I need to pause and find out for myself what's happening.
Mm.
I also think if you're going to do that repair with an adult child, it would be really useful to do it in a therapeutic setting rather than just trying to do it on your own.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure.
Great. Yeah. And then another review was trying to support the children we love through an experience we don't understand can feel like walking a tightrope over an alligator pit. But Sovec will take you by the hand, offer you a seat in a comfortable chair on solid ground, and explain everything clearly and without judgment. I want to share that because I think that's very important, because I think a lot of people, when they're learning about something that is alien to them, confusing to them, they've rejected it, they're defensive around it, they feel like they're going to be judged. That's their first thing. Well, they're going to think I'm this. Well, I'm not that, right? I don't have a problem with that. Right. And I think that this review shows that your book is a gentle introduction
Mhm.
for parents to help their kids. And was that your intention writing it?
Absolutely. I do education, activism, advocacy in the LGBTQ community. And I am one of those voices that will sit down with you and listen with my heart open and try and create change through dialogue. I have amazing friends who are out there in the front lines holding signs and screaming at the top of their voices. And we need both of these approaches and all the ones that go around it to make change happen in the world. And so I think there's not one right or wrong way to do it. This is just the way that works most authentically for me as both a person walking through the world and with my voice as an author. And, this idea of parents like on this tightrope with the alligators like nipping down below. Yeah, that's such a visceral description of what a lot of parents feel and that they're going through. And, you know, it's so important for parents to understand that when their kid comes out to them, they're going through a process too. It's not just their kid who's coming out. Coming out affects the entire family dynamic. It begins very small within the family, expands into the nuclear family, and then goes out into the bigger family and then the community. It has so many layers to it. And it's not just a one and done experience. Yay, my kid came in and told me they're queer. Okay, cool. Yay, off we go.
Right.
It is an
Right.
ongoing growth process for the entire family. And you don't need to do it perfect. You don't. Parents, you are allowed to stumble and fall along the way. The thing that we know, and this is the big thing that we do in couples therapy all the time, it's not if you make a mistake, it's how you repair from it.
Mhm.
And so those repairs are actually moments where we build a connection that goes deeper with our kids because we own up to having made a mistake in that moment. Especially I see this a lot with parents of trans kids. They've told them their authentic name, they've told them their pronouns, and a parent will misgender them,
Mhm.
and the parent will freak out. It's like, no, 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 no. It's okay.
Yeah.
Take a breath, relax, release, and then gender them in the correct pronoun so that you can meet them where they're at. Because if you sit there and make a big deal, I was like, oh, I know you told me this, and I'm being so awful, I'm the worst parent ever, blah, blah. What are you doing? You're making it about yourself all of a sudden.
Right, right. Yeah.
And so your kid just gets swept under the rug. But if you're like, I am so sorry, these are your pronouns, I apologize, and let's go get pizza. Okay, that you continue moving on and learning and growing together. Perfection is not the point of this. It's about learning from each other.
Mm, that's so true. And I think, fundamentally, most parents have really good intentions. They really do. They want to do right by their children, but parenting hits that ego so hard, right? So I think your book being a place to go either proactively or in response to something, to just begin to gain these very important tools that are used in the moment, right? Like these aren't, tools that are going to take years and years and years for you to develop. It's gentle tools that you can use in that moment to reset things with your child, or to do it differently and have real-time skills is so important, because I think most parents have really, really good intentions to want to support, accept, and be available for their children.
And that's one thing I want to grab hold of too, because I think this is so important. That if you join your kid on this journey of their coming out, as a parent, you are actually going to have some incredibly joyful, playful, wonderful moments. I know, we're talking about, going through the pain of the process, but there's also euphoria and excitement and wonderful moments, like when your gay son like takes his boyfriend to the prom for the first time and you get to take pictures. Like that is a moment that can be precious and wonderful and delightful in ways that you as a parent never saw coming. So I don't want us to always get caught in the message that this is always a challenge.
Right.
Understand too, as a parent of a queer kid, you're going to have a blast along the way too.
I love that. So what piece of advice, John, would you say has helped you heal a part of you that may have been wounded in the past when it came to your own journey?
Mm-hmm. I think for me personally, it's always about dropping into that quieter space that exists inside of me, being willing to sit with it. And then there's always like this one tiny little whisper of like a single word or a short phrase. And that to me is when I've dropped into that authentic self. And it helps me find my way through difficult times. If I go into that quiet space and there's also this like blah 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 blah, it's like, oh well, I'm not in a quiet space right now. That's still my ego
Drop a little
talking.
lower.
Yeah. But the messages are simple, they're quiet. And when I will pause long enough to hear that beautiful whisper, that's where change happens for me. And I also am very forgiving to myself and understanding that change is a seed that we plant. And I have to nurture it, I have to water it and feed it and occasionally trim it because some of the messages get off point, and then come back to it and be aware that it's still growing. And then some days you suddenly look back and you're like, I have this big, beautiful oak tree behind me now, this thing that I grew. I'm so proud of myself. And so I think there are all these layers to it for me personally. And it is an ongoing, beautiful journey. And for me, that's the excitement. It's a journey.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Beautiful, because Cristine and I talk about that so often on here, about the importance of getting still and getting quiet. And once again, it's sometimes easier said than done when it feels like you're in the cyclone of your life to, still yourself and align and be with yourself so you can hear that voice.
Yeah.
Right. What's the Zen thing? It's something like if I don't have 5 minutes to meditate, well, then you should be meditating for an hour.
We're gonna love to have you back to
Thank you. I'd love to come chat with you all again.